Thank you so much,
And the same thing for you, 20, we said, we start. You can see what's going on here.
It's challenging
Yeah, well, I want to talk about the German case, and the German case is interesting because Germany introduced an approach to promote green energy, which is in a way successful, which traveled to other countries from European states like Spain, Austria, Switzerland, to China and a number of other countries, and also to Ontario, which in 2009 introduced this approach to promote green energy in the electricity market. And my approach is narrow, not only that I'm talking about a member state of the European Union, so I'm talking about the national level, but I'm only talking about electricity market. I have a bit of broader perspective. I'm interested in understanding policy change, policy learning, policy innovation, and in particular what I would call policy transformation. Stephan just talked about Energiewende. This is the term you might know even in the English-speaking world, which is used still in Germany to describe what has happened after the decision of the Merkel government to stop nuclear energy. Well, Energiewende was in fact just a kind of twist and a turn of policy making. They changed the policy. They had changed 2 years earlier, which was a change of policy making of the former government. So this is part of the story. The real story started much earlier, and this is what we can label a process of far deeper transformation, if we understand as transformation, which is probably even more than transition, a process which implies a fundamental change in a longer time perspective of an energy system in a certain direction, namely towards green energy, and it's a change of the system which affects not only policy making but also technology, market, politics and society. Stephan just referred to the democratic approach of German energy policy. There's something in it, although I would present a different explanation. Now, this transformation started earlier than 2011 by an approach which had been introduced in 1991 by a law initiated by members of the German parliament, and that was a law which was revised as the German Renewable Energy Sources Act in 2000 and amended in several steps. And this law introduced an interesting approach which can be reduced to 3 elements. The first element is that this law regulated electricity market, so that renewable sources had access to energy, a privileged access to the energy market. Energy suppliers had been compelled to accept energy sources from green energy. This is the regulation. The second element is incentives. Those who invested in green energy had been guaranteed feed-in tariffs for 20 years. Meanwhile, they also introduced a market premium as a different approach. But what is important, the second element is incentives to invest in green energy. And the third element is that these subsidies, these investments had not been and are not paid by taxpayers, they are paid by the consumers. And the third element, and that is often underestimated, is that government this way created a kind of disincentive for consumers, or to put it in another way, an incentive to save energy by a surcharge on the market price of the energy. This is, so to speak, the mechanism they introduced, and the point is that this mechanism, this dynamics that had been created by this regulation related to the market, to the regulated market. It's not policy making that has driven the energy transformation, it was the market. Because this was a market-conforming approach, an approach which changed the market. First, by opening the market for green energy. Second, by providing subsidies in order to make new technologies in renewable energies competitive. Third, by, so to speak, internalizing the social costs of energy consumptions, the surcharge for consumer. Fourth, it was an incremental adjustment of subsidies in reaction to market development and technology development. There was a kind of administrative fine-tuning established in this approach, which led to these different changes in the energy law. And finally, since 2014, they strengthened the market approach by determining the subsidies by auction, so a market-like approach. The success story can be seen in this development of the share of renewable energy in the electricity market. Well, there could be even a bigger success story. Miranda has told us yesterday morning that this January we came up with 100% of production in electricity in renewable energy. Well, that's the result on a daily basis. I have here the figures for an annual basis, and the result in January was simply due to heavy winds in Germany. That was due to wind energy. It was not so, due to solar energy, because our winter was really without any. It was dark and it was ugly, and it was a winter without any sun. But it was a winter with a lot of rain and a lot of wind. So, but a nice winter in terms of energy transformation. Now, this is, so to speak, the immediate impact of this market regulation, but there's more in it. When we look at the transformative effects, the dynamics this approach has produced beyond the share of energy, which is of course important, then we see that the whole system of energy provision has changed, at least in tendency. Energy is much more decentralized. In former times, Germany had a quite centralized system of energy supply. The whole industry of energy has changed. The bigger companies lost in importance, and new industries producing renewables, be it wind, be it solar power, be it water power, emerged on the market. That also changed the political structure, the structure of interest intermediation, the former corporate structure, which was characterized by a close interaction between industry, big industries, and government, changed toward a more pluralistic system of interest intermediation in energy policy. We have new patterns of participation of stakeholders, experts, and civil society. This is in a way the democratization Stephan has talked about. And we also observe in Germany an overall paradigm change. This is expressed by the by the word Energiewende, which is used by administration, by politics, by the media, and which shows that we are thinking now in administration and in politics in a new way about energy. And there have been also spillover effects from the electricity market to heating, transport. The problem in Germany was that transport was for a long time a neglected issue, but meanwhile that has changed because there is a dynamics going on in this transformation project. So this is, so to speak, the positive side of the story. And I said this transformation was driven by the market. But this is a market which is a quite specific market. As you know, electricity market is a very specific market because you cannot store energy, you have to produce it and you have to consume it. And therefore, this is a market which has generates many problems. I talk about a market failure, which does not mean that the market doesn't work. This is not how economics use the term market failure. This means that the market can solve some problems, but it cannot solve other problems. And I now talk about the problems the market cannot solve. These are, so to speak, social problems. And in economy, you have two basic problems the market cannot solve. The one is social externalities, and the other is redistributive effects. And looking at the external effects, there is of course the problem of the infrastructure you need if you change an energy system from a centralized system to a more decentralized, where the supply of energy is in a quite different location than in a former system. So you have to adjust the grid. And this is an important issue which politics and policy making has to deal with, because the grid is nothing the market can provide. It's a natural monopoly in economic terms, so it's a public good. The second problem, you know this, these are impacts of investments in new energy, like wind turbines or other facilities which create impacts on a local level as to environmental effects and cause conflicts. Then we have cross-border effects across the borders of our country, because when we have too much energy supply to heavy winds or many sun in Germany, then we have an oversupply which we sometimes distribute to neighboring country. And there's one problematic effect which I only want to mention. This is a quite differentiated issue. Electricity oversupply is sometimes distributed at very low cost to neighboring country, including Switzerland and Austria, and it affects the energy market in these countries, and they produce hydro energy, and they have in particular pumped storage power plants. And the problem is that these plants have high investment costs, and if they are not cannot produce power, they, so to speak, still have their costs, and that had the consequence that some of these pumped storage power plants have problems to remain competitive. So, so to speak, the most important type of technology was in a way negatively affected by German energy transformation. Other problems relate to distributive effects, and very briefly we have social effects. One effect has to do with the surcharge and the rise of the electricity price consumers have to pay. This should create disincentives for consumption, but of course we have people who cannot invest in energy-saving devices, and they are particularly affected. The other is that there is that the discharge is not paid by electricity incentive companies. These are problematic social effects, and there are territorial effects because different regions are affected by these changes in different ways to their different production structures and their different needs in consumption. And to show you just the social effects, this is a curve. The upper one shows the rising energy prices paid by consumers, and the lower one shows you the rise of the cuts of energy supply for people who cannot pay the bill or who are not willing to pay the bill of energy costs. And this goes on in parallel. And the other effect is the regional distributive effects. Some of the Länder in Germany profit from the balance of feed-in payments to investors and the surcharge to consumers, and others have a negative balance. The interesting situation in Germany is that the richest land, Bavaria, is profited from this whole system. And of course, this is a reason for political response and political debate. And of course, there is a lot of critique in this process of energy transformation. And of course, politics has to respond to these problems. And the problem is that in the debates, meanwhile, the media and some parties argue that the whole process is not working. My argument is that the mechanism, the process as such is indeed working, but it has effects that has to be dealt with, but not in energy policy, but in related policies. This is to a certain degree done. This is a technical mistake in my presentation, so you have the whole argument at once. But that's ask me to speed up a little bit. The first is that grid development is an important issue meanwhile, and here, of course, they invented a quite interesting approach in Germany to develop the grid. I will not go into the detail. One of the problems is that this is at the federal level in a kind of power of corporatist structure between the grid operators for companies and the National Agency for Networks, who are responsible, is responsible for the planning. Nevertheless, this is a process which is open to citizens at all steps of this planning process. We can debate about this in extents. Then, of course, no, sorry. We have a lot of local conflicts which create a kind of politicization from below, because in particular wind energy is meanwhile under critique. Cross-border coordination works quite well. This is not a big issue. And as to the social effects, this is also not a big problem in Germany, because the local governments responded to the redistributive effects for consumers in need, and they support them, they advise them, and land governments introduce pilot projects. The territorial effects could be a serious problem. So far they are not, because German governments over the last years have been preoccupied with elaborating a new equalization system. So that looms in a way under the surface of politics, but there is party politics. And parties are meanwhile debating and supported by the medias on this whole transformation process, and questioning the whole approach of energy transformation. Therefore, what I want to say is there is the mechanism is a market mechanism, but it can easily be being politicized due to these external effects who have to be dealt with by politics. And therefore there is always the risk of path dependency by planning, by short-term planning. There is the risk of blockades due to political debates, and there is also, and this is clearly visible in Germany, the risk that we might return to old energies. This can be avoided, and this can be, we also learned from Germany, if market failures are coped with in the appropriate arenas, which are arenas not only at the federal level, where the approach has been invented, but also at the regional and local level, and including the European level. And this is the point where multi-level governance comes in. I think this market-conforming approach has to be supported by a multi-level governance approach. And in Germany we are used to a particular approach of multi-level governance, which means that federal and Länder government come to an agreement, and usually they come to an agreement and create compromises. In fact, what we observe in this energy policy is that they have created a number of negotiating arenas and platforms where they communicate about different issues on energy policy, and these are quite loosely covered. So we have platforms at the national level, at the regional level, and also networks at the local level. And we have, of course, also the developing European Energy Union. Can be seen as a kind of soft power, because the European Union so far has no power to intervene in the national energy mix. So this kind of loosely coupled arenas might work fairly well, because it's a kind of multi-level governance which allows to change policies, adjust policies, allows policy learning, allows decentralized energy policy innovation, diffusion based on central policy making, and it could be quite dynamic, flexible, and could allow for incremental adjustment. If it works in this way, we don't know if it will continue to work in this way, but if this could be a kind of model of multi-level policy making, which is, to come back to what Miranda has said, quite complicated. It's multi-level, it's dynamic, and I think it should be. And so energy transformation, that's my basic argument, requires the market mechanism, a regulated market mechanism, but it also requires a particular pattern of multi-level coordination in a quite flexible and dynamic way. So this is the end of the story.
Thanks so much, Arthur.